Hi everyone, this is audap. Let's continue our game of Iwaihime on PC.
黒髪家の生贄たちを慰めてきた人形がここで供養されているのよ。
これが全部。
一般から受け付けた人形供養はお焚き上げするからここには置かれない。ここに現存するものはすべて黒髪家の生贄が使った人形たちなのよ。
There were way too many of them to even begin counting. Most of them were brand new. They must have been the ones Kurakami had used. All of them were a testament to how long she'd suffered. Now that I thought about it, she'd been on my mind from the moment I first laid eyes on her. I knew it sounded arrogant, but it felt like it was my destiny to do something about this. I want to save her. I finally understood what my heart had been telling me ever since I first saw her.
先生が僕に何を話したかったのか理解しました。僕にできることがあれば何でも協力させてください。
ススハラ君、ありがとう。
Once she realized the nightmares that been plaguing her were in fact hauntings, Miss Hinagata had started researching them. In doing so, she traced their source back to the curse that Susada had passed down for the last 1,000 years. What she wanted was simple: to save the descendants of the original sacrifice who were all still suffering from the cursed soot. To break the chains of the curse that had persisted for a millennium and to save them. And through the LCSC, she had finally found a way to alleviate the hauntings. But that wasn't enough. It was at that point she met me.
ススハラ君さえ良ければ、ぜひ一度ススハラ君のお父さんと話をさせてほしいの。ススハラ流親善武術、それにどうして霊障を抑える力が宿るのか、そのメカニズムが解明できれば生贄の末裔たちを救うことができるかもしれない。
黒髪さんを救う手がかりが見つかるかもしれない。
そうね。もし親善武術を学ぶことでその力を得られるのなら、私ススハラ流に入門、親善武術を極める、霊障克服のみならず親善武術部創設へ。ススハラ君を部長に迎えちゃったりとかね。
The Susahara Divine Tribute Style, traditional martial arts that had been passed down through my family for generations. I'd been training in it my whole life, yet I never knew much about it. Perhaps now was the time to finally learn. And maybe, just maybe, I'd discover a hint towards saving Kurakami.
今日はありがとう。長々と突拍子もない話に付き合ってくれて、そして信じてくれて。
いいえ、今は自分が役に立てることが分かって嬉しいくらいです。そしてできることなら黒髪さんも救ってあげたい。
その方法を私と一緒に探しましょう。
はい、社長コブには行ける限り参加しようと思います。僕がいればみんなの霊障が抑えられるんですよね。
ええ、そして誰かがひどい霊障に倒れた時には呼ぶから駆けつけてほしいの。
もちろんです。いつでも呼んでください。
黒髪さんの様子もよく見ていてほしいの。あまりに体調が悪そうだったら私に伝えてね。それから彼女の人形、
霊障を和らげる重要なものですね。
それでも霊障でぼんやりしててうっかり手放してしまうこともあるの。
その時は人形を拾って手渡してあげればいいんですね。
ええ、 私も注意して見てるけど、鈴原くんもお願いね。万が一にも壊してしまうことがないように注意してね。
もし壊れてしまったら。
彼女以外の誰にも想像もできないくらいの恐ろしい霊障が一度に彼女に襲いかかるでしょうね。
おい、お前、俺の言うことなら何でも聞くんだよな。
はい、翔様。
あのさ、質問だけどさ、お前がいっつも抱いてるその人形と俺、どっちが大事よ。つうかさ、焼けるんだよね。俺のこと一目惚れとか言い名付けとか言いながらよ、一番の仲良しはそのお人形ちゃんなわけだろ。俺の言うこと何でも聞けるならよ、その人形連れて歩くのいい加減にしろよ。
それはできないです。
ああ
Sho was blinded with rage. To have the girl who did anything he ordered without complaint defy him in any way infuriated him more than anything else. But due to the roar of the music and the lighting, none of his followers noticed.
てめえが土下座したから俺は許嫁様になってやったんだろうが。あ俺に捨てられたらてめえみてえなきめえ女誰も相手にしねえんだぞこら。仕方かよ。
Sho snatched the doll from Toei. Toei wrestled with him in an attempt to get it back. Sho was a bit surprised by the unexpected display of strength.
だってめやる気か。
返して返して
なめんなクソ甘っ。
When Sho tugged hard on the doll, the two were sent flying back. The doll had been torn to pieces.
なんだこりゃ。
Something that looked like a spine dangling out of the head of the doll Sho was holding. It was dark red, thick and wriggled nauseatingly.
姫マジかよマジかよ。
Sho threw it to the ground, got up and stomped it over and over with all his might. His followers finally noticed and watched in shock as their leader kept stomping in a sudden fit of agitation.
どうしたんすか。こいつの人形超きめえってなんか動いてたし動いてたし。
The ground by Sho's feet was too dark for his followers to make out due to the strobe lights. All they could tell was that something had him freaked out. Not wanting to get mixed up with whatever it was, all they could do was watch in silence.
翔さん、女泡吹いてるっすよ。
ああ
Toei was lying on the sofa. Foam and saliva were spewing from her mouth.
うわ、きってね。大丈夫っすかこいつ。なんか決めてんじゃないっすか。
こいつたまに意識飛ぶんだよな。ほっときゃケロッと起きるから気にすんな。
Sho had seen Toei lose consciousness due to sudden hauntings more times than he cared to count. So he just urged his followers to get back to singing, and before long they turned away from Toei and resumed their partying. Sho threw his feet onto the table and glared sullenly at Toei. Toei continued foaming at the mouth. Gradually, the bubbles darkened before going as black as ink. Then, all of a sudden, she slowly opened her eyes. No one noticed the way they glowed like flames flickering in the darkness. Toei slowly raised her head. She raised her hand into the air, closed her fingers one after another, and stretched them out, almost like she was trying to learn how she functioned. She wiped her mouth, and her lips curled into a smirk. After that, she crawled over to Sho and placed her head on his chest as if listening for his heartbeat.
どうしちゃったよ。積極的じゃねえか。
Sho thought of Toei only as a robot who performed commands on a delayed timer, so he was stunned to see her do something of her own volition. His eyes met hers. Her face was shrouded in shadow, but her eyes and lips looked bewitching in the light. Sho couldn't help but gulp.
感謝するぞ、ショー。
That was the first time she hadn't called him Sir. Normally, Sho would have run out of patience with her right then and there, but there was something in Toei's voice that sent shivers down his spine.
千年、人間のクズの中のクズにはおよそ出会い尽くしたが、お前はその中でもなかなかの上物だったぞ。
Those words should have been insults to him, yet they stirred immoral pleasure within Sho. That enticing creature with Toei's face had completely seized his soul.
それにしても黒髪め、このような男をよくも見つけ出したものだ。この時世、すすの一粒も持たぬ男などよくも見つけたものだが、もういい。最高の地層が現れたのだから。
お前、さっきから何を言って。
生臭い。喋るな、人間。
Toei placed her slender hand on Sho's chin, as though to lift it up. Sho trembled as her fingers stroked the underside of his jaw. Bit by bit, his head began convulsing. All of a sudden, his eyes rolled back, and his mouth shot open as a trail of drool ran down his face.
人の子らはゲスのことを畜生とも呼ぶな。ならばそれにふさわしく角をくれてやろう。
Blood sprayed out of Sho's ears. Just then, claws manicured with crimson blood poked out of his ear holes. They were fingers, Toei's dainty fingers. They emerged slowly from Sho's auditory canals. At that moment, there was a crack, and drops of blood leaked from Sho's eyes and nose. Even more antlers. No, those were also Toei's fingers, poked out of him. 2 more of them pierced through Sho's skull like horns.
立派な角だな。畜生にはふさわしかろう。
She removed her hands from his chin, and viscid blood started gushing out. One of Sho's followers happened to turn his head and witnessed the whole thing. Even amidst the dazzling light show, he could tell from a glance Sho was dead, his eyes agape and body stained with blood. The follower's pathetic shriek drew the attention of the rest, who each screamed one after another.
敬意の眼差しも悪くはないが、
やはりイフの方が心地よいか。
Toei grimaced, as though suffering from a headache. A sound like snapping tree branches resounded loudly through the room. The delinquents' eyes went wide as saucers as they were rendered speechless by the spectacle unfolding before them. Every one of them could clearly see antlers growing out of Toei's head. They were the majestic antlers of a sacred deer. Toei groaned as she gripped her head.
逃げて早く。
They all heard her, of course, but they were too stunned to move. Though the room was bursting with sound and color, time stood still.
ひれ伏せ、人鬼どもめ。
お待たせしました。
The employee bringing the group's orders bumped into Toei just as she opened the door.
失礼しました。
Once the employee moved out of the way, Toei left the room and disappeared down the dark hallway. The employee couldn't help but be overcome with surprise at the girl's extraordinary bearing. She quickly composed herself and entered the room. The spell to seal the cursed soot into a sacrifice. The mayor had gathered several of the elders and engaged them in an unproductive discussion about who its target would be. They had to choose one sacrifice, but it wouldn't just end with them. In order to keep the curse sealed, they would need to have a child to bear the curse and raise them, a cycle that would go on for all eternity.
もちろん村を救うための人柱となるのじゃ。村を挙げて支え感謝するぞ。
On the surface, the sacrifice would be praised as the hero who saved the village. But in reality, there was no way any villager would willingly interact with the clan of someone bearing such an ominous curse. They would just be ostracized by the whole village, and their descendants would likely be subjected to the same treatment. So no one wanted to step up to the task, not when it meant condemning their family to eternal damnation in every sense. But the whole village would be destroyed if they didn't choose a sacrifice and perform the ritual. Unlike the present, this wasn't an era where people were free to choose where they lived. Now that the land was cursed, they had nowhere to run.
すす封じの儀式は明日の朝に執り行わねば間に合わぬそうじゃ。何としても選び出さねばならぬぞ。どうしても決まらぬというならば、くじで決めざるを得んが。そうじゃ。妙案がある。
How about that Asusa priestess? Everyone looked at each other with surprise.
儀式のやり方は分かっとるんじゃろ。別にあずさみ子がおらんでも儀式はできるはずじゃ。
おお、そうじゃ。儀式をするのにあのあずさみ子は必要ない。
Susanome was an outsider. She had no family. What's more, she met all the conditions for the sacrifice, and as a priestess, she fit the part perfectly.
それでよいな、皆の しゅう。
Everyone nodded. Unbeknownst to them, Mutsu had overheard the entire thing. He and Susanome had been preparing to bury the old woman when he'd been struck by a sense of dread. As it turned out, his foreboding had been well founded.
鈴の目逃げるんだ。
Susanome blinked in surprise, but Mutsu grabbed her by the arm and dragged her to her feet.
何事ですか？痛いです。話してください。
後で話す。今は黙って走るんだ。
The villagers could not understand why the pair was running, but their confusion turned to rage after the mayor spoke.
その女を逃がすな。捕まえるのじゃ。
何事かわかりませぬ。
あいつら君を生贄にするつもりだ。
女子連れじゃそうは遠くに行けんはず。隠れて夜を待つつもりに違いない。探すのじゃ。
Though Susanome was used to traveling, she had little chance of escaping several men in the prime of their lives. Her only choice was to hide for now and flee under the cover of night. But the men knew the mountain just as well as Mutsu.
なんとしてもあのあずさみ子を捕らえるのじゃ。今日中に捕らえ、明朝の儀式の生贄とせねば村は滅ぶぞ。
あずさみ子を捕まえろ。生贄にするのじゃ。
生贄は命があればよい。抵抗するなら腕の一本や二本へし折っても構わぬ。
女の足じゃ逃げ切れるわけがない。おそらくどこかに隠れているんじゃ。
Hold on a minute. Sorry about that.
ここいらにはおらんな。向こうを探すぞ。
こっち。
今、藪の向こうで音が聞こえたぞ。
おい、そこにいるか。
アホ、わしらじゃこっちにはおらんぞ。
言ったようだね。今のうちに行こう。峠の向こうは森が深い。そこに明日まで身を潜めているんだ。生贄の儀式というのは明日の朝に必要なんだからね。それまで身を潜めていれば鈴の目を追う理由はなくなるはず。
でもそれでは村が六神様の呪いに。
どうしても生贄が見つからないなら、その時は僕が生贄になるよ。
そんな、どうしてムツが。これは彼らの六神様のお山を犯した者たちの罪ではありませんか。それに最初から反対していたムツが生贄になることなどありませぬ。
生贄になったって死ぬわけじゃないんでしょ。
本来は村全体が被るべき呪いを一人で背負うのですよ。死には至らなくともどれほどの苦しみになるか想像も。
でも誰かが引き受けなくちゃならない。 今はみんな冷静じゃないけれど、本当はとても優しい人たちばかりなんだ。こんな目にあって鈴の目には信じられないかもしれないけど、本当はすごくいい村なんだよ。なのに君にこんな仕打ちをするなんて。僕は悔しい。
おい、あそこにおったぞ。
まずい、走るんだ。
おったぞ、おったぞ。
どこじゃどこじゃ。ああ、いたぞ。あそこだ。
Men with bloodshot eyes rushed out of the thicket, one after the next. Suzunome was already out of breath. Escape was impossible.
君は走って、僕は食い止める。振り返らないで。さよなら、鈴の目。
Neither wanted this to be how they parted. But that was exactly why Suzunome couldn't afford to stop. She couldn't let Mutsu's final act of chivalry go to waste. So all she could do was pray for his safety as she ran. Mutsu was kind by nature, but he would fight for his life if needed. The men came charging at him full speed once they saw him. Yet, much to their surprise, Mutsu threw one into a thicket. Apparently, they hadn't expected the cornered rat to fight back.
血迷ったが。血迷ったのはどっちだ。恥を知れ。六神様のお山を犯しのみならず、巫女様の恩にあだで返すなんて言語道断だ。
叶うな、女を追うんだ。
行かせるものか。
離さんかバカ者。
行かせないぞ。彼女は逃がす。走れ、走るんだ、鈴の目。
Susanome pushed through the thicket and descended the slope as Mutsu's voice echoed around her. But she tripped on something and fell to the ground. She twisted her ankle. Susanome got up and limped away like a newborn fawn. However, there was no way she could run in that condition. The villagers' shouts grew closer and closer as they rushed through the thicket. All she could do was pray and hide in the thicket. Please, do not let them find me. And please, keep Mutsu safe. A parting like this is far too tragic. The villagers were closing in fast.
おったぞ、あずさみこじゃ。
The village youths were on the ground of the abandoned temple, rolling the bell in unison to prepare for the ritual. The soot sealing spell required a giant metal cauldron. They would seal the sacrifice and the soot they'd gathered from the village into it for 3 days and 3 nights, until the sacrifice had absorbed all of the soot inside. The village had no giant cauldron, so the temple's bronze hanging bell was the perfect substitute. It would be tilted over partway and held up by logs, an arrangement often used in animal traps. Once the sacrifice and the soot were put through the gap, the logs would be removed, sealing them both inside the bell. Susanome stood in front of the bell with her hands tied behind her back, as though she were a common thief, listening to the mayor with a detached expression.
手荒なまねを心より申し訳なく思う。だがどうかこの村を救うためにその身を捧げていただきたい。
Is Mitsu all right? I cannot see him anywhere. He opposed the village's decision. It would not be surprising if they killed him. He fought to give me a chance to escape. I hope he's alive. Those thoughts were all that occupied Susunome's mind. The ritual preparations before her felt so far away.
無論村の呪いを一身に引き受けてくれたあんたを生涯丁重に扱うと約束する。だから頼む。どうか生贄を引き受けてくださらんか。
Susanome didn't answer. She simply continued spacing out, giving no indication as to whether she'd heard a single word. The mayor rose to his feet and whispered into her ear.
お前さんがどうしても引き受けてくれないというなら仕方がない。ムツ、その役目を頼むほかはないよ。
The mayor didn't overlook Susanome's reaction. He was already aware of their relationship, so he decided to take full advantage of it.
生贄は子に呪いを引き継がねばならない。ならば、ムツと夫婦になればよくよ。生贄になってくれれば、村はあんたを生涯敬う。あんたもムツと生涯を過ごせる。本来なら、ムツは村の裏切り者、許されぬ罪じゃ。あんたが生贄を引き受けてくれれば、それを許してやって。
Susanome wept. Shortly thereafter, she raised her head and looked the mayor in the eye.
わかりました。秘術の生贄をお引き受けいたしまする。
おお。
ですからどうかどうかムツの罪だけはお許しください。
Mutsu finally regained consciousness to the sensation of an insect tickling his nose. He was lying face down in a grove on a steep slope. He'd fallen down said slope while grappling with one of Susanome's pursuers. Then he'd hit his head on something and passed out. The air was still. Mutsu couldn't sense anyone nearby, no matter how hard he strained his ears. His stomach churned with a horrible sense of dread. If Susanome had still been in hiding, the villagers would still be combing the mountain, and they would have questioned Mutsu on her whereabouts. They just left him alone. Mutsu slowly got to his feet, ignoring the aching throughout his body. When he cleared the woods, the abandoned temple on the opposite mountain came into view. Mutsu could see a large crowd of villagers gathered there. Alright, why don't we stop it there? This is Audapostrophe. You've been watching Iwaihime on PC. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching. I will see you at the next stream.